And live today on Webinar Wednesday. Hey, everybody, how the heck you doing this fine day? Steve Dotto here along with April. How are you doing, April?
I'm good. Happy Wednesday. My favorite day of the week.
Sorry?
I said one of my favorite days of the week, besides Friday, of course, but I like Wednesday too.
I can't believe we're in May already.
So it's funny you say that because my mother-in-law, we were talking to her this morning, Kevin and I had to give her all these dates of like things like we can't do this because, I don't know, June, like all these June dates. It's crazy.
It is indeed. So I see everybody coming in. It is great to see you one and all. It's a little bit different this week for Webinar Wednesday. We're back in our old haunts. We're back in Demio for today's webinar. So thank you all for making the adjustment and coming in and joining us. It is going to be, structure-wise, it's going to be a typical Webinar Wednesday where I've pre-recorded the main part of the demo. But it's a little bit different because we don't typically on Webinar Wednesday launch a product. We don't actually incorporate very many sales aspects to Webinar Wednesday, but we are launching a brand new product that I have been working on, a brand new course that I've been working on for, I've been working on this for about 6 months, April?
Almost. I would say about 4.5, 5, yeah.
It's actually about 8 years in the making, but 6 months in development. So I am very excited to be sharing that. And if the truth be told, a little bit anxious because we never know how it's going to be, how well it's going to be received. But we will be presenting that to you in just a few minutes. So the structure today will be a little bit of a warm up. It's going to be a little bit different because it's a true hybrid webinar because I've got a slideshow off the top, a little bit of a slideshow setting the stage. Then the main demo will be pre-recorded while we are in chat with you, and then we'll come back and there'll be a slideshow at the end as I tell you about the new offering, the new course that we are offering and we are launching to you, our community, today. So it's going to be just slightly different, but it'll have pretty much the same feel. We will have a replay going out to you on tomorrow morning. It'll be sent out to you tomorrow morning. And this particular, because we're launching a product, there's going to be a 5-email sequence that we're going to be going through, which is really a nurture campaign for those of you who might be interested in taking the course, illustrating a little bit more about what's involved in the course. Now, if you don't want to receive it, that's fine. But if you don't want to receive it, in the very first email that we send to you, there'll be an opt-out. So you're not opting out of our mail list. You're just opting out so you don't get the additional emails from this. We don't want to overwhelm you with email over the next couple of weeks or next couple of days. So that's just a heads up for the for the process that we're going to be going through over the next few days. We've got a lot of content to cover, and I don't want to go beyond the top of the hour if we can avoid it. We might be going a little bit longer with the Q&A, but I want to make sure all of the main content is in. So I think, April, what we'll do is we will jump in and we will just get going. What do you think?
I think that sounds right. Awesome.
Okay, so I'll send you back, and I will get going and we'll see how it's all working out. All right, folks. Just so glad that you are joining us. We'll just, as we're getting ready to go, let me check that my slides are all working. There it is. Oh, that's not the one I wanted. That's the one I wanted. Y'all see the slides? That's good. All right. As I mentioned, this is going to be a little bit different than our normal webinar because we are launching a product at the end. So I'm going to encourage you to stick around to the very end to hear about our brand new bootcamp, which we are launching for Patreon creators. But let me start by filling you in on kind of a little bit what you can expect. Today's webinar is really the genesis of this, and the main focus was for me to help creators, other people who do content creation, understand how Patreon can help you form better connection with your audience and with your community. As creators look at different funding models, as we create our content, we have to, of course, pay the bill somehow. So we consider basically two main funding models. We consider membership sites or digital products like online courses, and both are great options for content creators. But there's a third great option, which I want to share with you today, which is how Patreon fits in that mix. So if you have or are building a platform and you want to generate ongoing income, I think you're in the right place. I'm going to be talking about Patreon from a content creator's perspective. Now, I know many of you have only seen Patreon as a patron or a supporter, but here you're going to get a look inside the inner workings. We're going to dive right into the bowels. That doesn't sound too appealing, does it? But we are going to dive into the bowels of Patreon. Now, I want you to help me out for a moment here. I've got a poll here. Let me just cue up the poll, and it's just going to help me understand a little bit more about who is in the community today, because I'm not positive exactly what the mix is. So here are the questions. I'm going to share the poll with you right now, and it should be up. There it is. Good. So are you a content creator and you want to get started on Patreon? Are you a content creator, but you're already on Patreon, perhaps? You've tested it out a bit. Maybe you've had success or failure, and you're looking to up your game. Maybe you're not a content creator yet, but you're curious. And of course, there's always going to be a few of you who misread our promotional materials and thought this was about Peloton, not Patreon. To you, I apologize. But having a look here, we've got the majority of content creators who want to get started with Patreon, which warms my heart because that's the sweet spot. Not that this isn't going to be interesting and valuable to everybody else, but that is the exact kind of my laser focused targeted market on this. And the odd person who thought this was Peloton, sorry, you're gonna be confused for the entire course of the day. All right. Let's get into it now, and let's move on to get me going there. There we are. All right. So let me share the goals that we have in place for today, for today's content. And when we're done, I intend for you all to understand the strengths. Oh, actually, before I do that, let me just share the result. Can I do that? Or is it coming up? End poll. Just a minute. I got to find how to end poll. I know it's in here somewhere. Results are visible. Okay. I guess that's it. I don't too sure. I might have missed something here. If you can figure out, April, how to end the poll, that would be great. Oh, maybe once I voted. There it is. Yes. Okay. Everybody's got the results. Now I know what's happening. Sorry. I haven't run a poll in Demio for a while. All right. When we're done today, I intend for you to understand the strengths and weaknesses of Patreon, and it's from a creator's perspective. And if you are a creator, I hope that you're going to learn exactly how Patreon fits for you. And if it is a fit, to give you a good idea how you're going to get there to make it work for you. It's important that we all understand the differences and the similarities between the different funding models, Patreon, membership sites, and learning management systems. And so I intend for us to explore how to put a plan in place as well, how to launch a successful Patreon campaign. And finally, I want to launch our new Patreon bootcamp for those of you who think Patreon is a good fit for you. So here are the details that we're going to be covering. So what's going to happen is I've got the demo pre-recorded where I'm going to go through these kind of 10 basic content areas over the next few minutes here. So we're going to talk about what Patreon is and how it is different from the other funding models, who Patreon is for, what type of creators it works best for. So important, the creator-patron relationship. That's so crucial to the success on Patreon, is understanding what our relationship is like and the fundamental difference between Patreon and membership sites and learning management tools. Then we're also going to talk about how Patreon works. We're going to actually take a tour right inside my dashboard of my real Patreon account so you can see what I see on a daily basis and what creators see on a daily basis, as opposed to what you may see as a supporter. How much does it cost to use? And then we're going to boil it down to, I believe that I've identified 4 keys for creators to kind of, if they've got access to all 4 of these keys, if you have these keys, I believe that it's not a question of if, but a question of when you can be successful with Patreon if you are a creator. And I've got a bonus for you. I worked out I wanted to prove and give people an idea of how much money they can earn on Patreon, because it drives me crazy seeing what other people are earning, but not really having any context to how that reflects on my own account. So I actually spent a lot of time doing research and trying to figure out an equation where people could look at, say, how many email subscribers they have, how large their following is in different subscriptions, and translate that into revenue on Patreon to get an idea of what you could realistically earn. I'm going to share that equation with you. It is pure gold. So we're talking today about real actionable items coming up. So let me jump into the video, and when it is done, I will return. Well, while it's going on, of course, April and I will be in chat with you, but when the video is done, we will come back and answer more of the questions live. But let's get going into this part of it right now. The video, by the way, 35 minutes, so we'll still have a good 15 minutes at the end. I've been using Patreon for a very long time. I do believe I am qualified to be classified as OG. Now, I've distilled the steps towards success on Patreon, I believe, into 4 keys. This is pure gold if you are a content creator. Now, I'm not going to tell you that this is the only route to success on Patreon, but I am going to tell you that if you possess these 4 keys, then you can unlock the secret to recurring, reliable revenue on Patreon. So before we get started, though, I want to set the stage and also set some expectations. First of all, the opinions that I'm sharing here are my opinions, my ideas. They are not Patreon's, nor are they anyone else's. It is on me, the opinion that is being shared here today. And it's based on my experience after 7 years on Patreon. I launched my Patreon page in April of 2014, so that is a little bit over 7 years ago now. And Patreon itself was only formed in May of 2014, so I was on board before the service was even 1 full year old. As I said, that does confer upon me OG status. Now, over that time, I've modified my account strategy several times as I've learned what works and what does not work on Patreon. But Patreon has consistently been there for us. And over 7 years, it has generated over $400,000 in income so far. That is significant. And it continues to provide, to be one of my financial pillars, generating income reliably, month after month. And I got to tell you, as a creator, being able to count on consistent, reliable income, it's a godsend. It is really taken a lot of pressure off of me. So I want to start by getting on the same page with our terms, because I'll be using a few terms over and over again. And I want to make sure that we have absolute clarity between us what I'm referring to with these terms. And the first term is creators. I've been using it already a lot. Creators are those of us who create some content as a part of our online business. Content can be videos or podcasts or blog posts or live streams or more traditional offerings like music, artwork, animation, books, graphic novels. Content can be training, it can be instruction, it can be motivational, or it can be advice-based. It can be educational or entertaining, or both, hopefully both. And creators, our first term, were defined by the content that we create. Where creators distribute and share their content is our next term. That term is platform. And like a political platform, it's made kind of up of planks. Your social networks, your mail list, everybody's platform looks a little bit different, but it's the places that your content is shared. Personally, for me, my platform is first and foremost my YouTube channel, then my podcast, our webinars. This webinar here is a part of our platform, my mail list. Those are the places where I'm well established and I reach out to my community and I've built an audience. That is my platform. You will know what your platform is because it's the place where you publish your content. And then patrons, well, there are supporters, but we can also look at them as members of our membership. But one thing I never consider patrons to be, and we will talk more about this later, is customers. Patrons appreciate and they consume the content that we create, and they see value in that content and are willing to, or hopefully happy, to pay to support us in the creation of that content. And finally, this is one of the terms that I struggle with the most. Maybe it's just an internal an internal switch for me. But campaigns and pages, they're kind of interchangeable terms in the Patreon world. They are the offer that Patreon creators make to their patrons. They're the perks and their benefits. Now, we sometimes call them your Patreon page because there's an anchor page on Patreon where you share all of the details. And this is where people sign up to support you. So we often end up what we call our Patreon offering, our Patreon page. And how we support our community and how we grow it, kind of the strategy behind it, that's our Patreon campaign. It's the mechanism that encourages people to support us. So when Patreon creators talk to each other, we use these terms interchangeably. We refer to our Patreon accounts as campaigns or pages. And I just think that can sometimes be confusing. So when I talk about Patreon pages and campaigns, I'm really talking about the account that we have and how it moves forward. Patreon was originally launched because there's always been a disconnect between creators and their fans. It was envisioned by Jack Conte, who was frustrated by how musicians were being treated by the major players online. And musicians are in many ways the poster child of Patreon. Historically, they've been taken advantage of by middleman after middleman. In the advent of the internet, though, and streaming music service, it threatened to break the hold of major record labels, so musicians could, for the first time, see a new path forward, only, unfortunately, to have that path hijacked by iTunes and other gatekeepers. So Patreon was born out of that frustration that, yet again, creators were being held hostage by these gatekeepers. Access to their fans was managed through this middleman. iTunes is the kind of the black hat in this particular round. So the goal was to create a mechanism to give creators direct access to their fans. Of course, the more cynical amongst us will point out that one middleman, say iTunes, has been replaced by another middleman, Patreon. After all, what is Patreon if not a middleman? That's a fair point. But transparency and control are the key. You see, when a creator has a relationship with Patreon, they know up front what Patreon's cut is going to be. The creators set their own prices and their own benefits. Creators also can download their supporter list at any time, email them directly, and have direct conversations with them. This is huge. You see, Patreon controls the platform, but the creators control the content and the relationship. Now, there's always going to be some friction, of course, but this is vastly different than what came before. So let me explain it again, just because it is so important. Unlike Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or TikTok or any other social platform, and unlike Amazon or Audible or iTunes or Spotify or any other service, the creator owns the relationship. A publisher on YouTube cannot download their list of email addresses from YouTube and directly reach out to them. A publisher on Patreon can. The Patreon creator owns the relationship, whereas Patreon owns the platform. So let's start by looking at how we fit into Patreon. And I think there's three kind of creator archetypes in Patreon, and I'm going to share them with you. And I think almost all creators fall into one or sometimes more than one of these three broad categories, but these are broadly the way that Patreon campaigns are run. The first is education, and it's training, course-based skills. Now, those courses can be on anything. They can be on art or music or programming. They can be DIY, home improvement, or the like. They can be academically focused on math or writing. And we will lump all of these creators into the knowledge category, creators who create knowledge products. Next are premium or gated content. These are typically podcasts, serial stories. They could be video series. They could be a series of stories, or they could be a book that's being released chapter by chapter, a serial story that's being released chapter by chapter. It can be music. It's content that the patron is paying for the production of, and they're going to consume primarily from an entertainment point of view. They are looking to be entertained. So this is the closest thing to Patreon being a Netflix or a YouTube, where we're delivering entertainment-based content to the community, which is gated. It's gated, and it's not there for the general public. The term gated means it's not there for the general public, but it's only there for the enjoyment and for the benefit of the patrons. It's behind some sort of we would call it a paywall if we were talking about a newspaper or a podcast that was being published directly, but it's behind the Patreon paywall at that particular point. It's behind the membership wall in Patreon. And where these really work well is when you have a repository of older content. We often will see podcasters only have, say, their last 5 episodes of the podcast available to the public, but they have a back catalog of maybe hundreds of podcasts that are just available to their patrons. It's a terrific model for that. And then the third business model is fan sites. It's access. It's about having a relationship with the creator. And it's all about increased interaction and access to that creator. Now, this can be A, B, or C-list celebrities, as well as specialized content. Now, how can I put this? Adult content, not safe for work. It's where the artist is giving direct access, intimate access sometimes, to themselves, to their patrons, and to their community. Now, the key to this type of site this type of Patreon account is backstage access to the creator and early access to the content. Now, other examples might be musicians releasing their songs on Patreon a week or two before they publish them on iTunes or Spotify or on YouTube, for example. We also see fans of TV shows that are looking for more detailed backstage access. So hosting live shows after the broadcast of the show, fan sites, creating fan fiction around it, having occasional stars from the shows coming on. But it's all very much access to the celebrity based or access to the creator based. Those are fan sites. And there have to be thousands, literally thousands of models of this type of site. But now I want to take a quick step back because it's not a perfect world in Patreon. And now I don't necessarily want to throw cold water on everybody as they imagine these different business models working great for them. But the reality of a Patreon account can sometimes be somewhat sobering. In fact, currently only 8% of creators earn over $500 per month on Patreon. This was the statistic that got me started and got me down the path of wanting to teach people how to use Patreon more effectively. Only 8% of creators earn over $500 per month, and only 4% reach $1,000 per month. But once they hit those marks, there's remarkably little churn and just steady growth. So once you kind of get past that, past the tipping point, you're in great shape. But only 8% get past that first tipping point. So I've got a question for you. Does that number encourage you or discourage you? Here's my take. When I saw these numbers, I asked myself, what separates the 4% from the rest? And to me, the difference is actually pretty clear. Successful Patreon creators understand the Patreon difference, first and foremost. They understand how Patreon is different from other funding models, and they lean into that difference. So I believe that one of the reasons 92% of the creators earn under $500 a month is they really don't understand what Patreon is and how it's different. So let's go there now. Specifically, the first question is, how is Patreon different from the main other funding models? I'm speaking of membership sites and LMSs, or learning management tools. So let's begin by talking about the similarities, because there are a lot of similarities. Patreon shares a lot of the features with membership tools like Kajabi or Mighty Networks, and a lot with the learning management tools like Thinkific or Teachable. Now, a lot of the mechanical process of signing up members, delivering rich content, it can be accomplished by either of these services. And in some cases, the other services that we're talking about do so more affordably than Patreon. They might be a better choice. So this is a big part of your decision journey. If you're considering Patreon, you need to understand what the nature is of Patreon that makes it different from the nature of the typical publisher on one of those other platforms. And I believe that the biggest difference between Patreon and all of these other services is on Patreon, you have supporters. On the other platforms, you have customers. There is a world of difference. In a membership site or a traditional course, you get paid for the content that you've created. People are buying it from you. They are your customers. The deliverable is the content that you've created. However, patrons support the creator's efforts to create the content, and the reward they get is called a perk. It's not necessarily purchasing access to the content, but it's being given a perk, a benefit over and above. As a result, patrons are vested in the success of the creators that they support because they feel like they're part of the process. They aren't purchasing the result. I'll speak from my personal experience because we have both models in our business. And in our Thinkific account, which is an LMS account, we have over 14,000 students. And I'm very proud of that. And I feel very strongly about those customers who support us and are on those platforms. But the 800 patrons who have stepped up to support me on Patreon and said, we support and value you and we want to contribute to help you make more content, well, they hold a very different and a very special relationship with me. I'm of the opinion that most Patreon creators see their patrons in a very different light than they see their traditional customers, and most patrons hold their creators that they support in higher esteem as well. You know, they're your 100 raving fans. And a fan is a good term to use for what a patron is, because they're supporting you because of what you do, not because of what you've done. I hope that makes sense. Then there's also mechanical differences between Patreon membership sites and learning management tools. Patreon, one of the benefits of Patreon is it's so easy to manage. So that creators can actually end up spending more time creating content and nurturing their relationships and less time administering their community. And there are very few add-ons. You have to make very few decisions as you set up a Patreon account. Very few design decisions. Patreon is pretty much, it's kind of locked in one sort of format. So you can concentrate on the content you create for it rather than designing the environment that your patrons are visiting. And patrons will find it very easy to navigate because Patreon has taken on the responsibility of building a logical user access system that makes it easy for the patrons to get through it. Now, with membership sites, you can spend as much time troubleshooting the technology as creating and delivering content. And I speak from personal experience, and anybody who has installed a membership plugin in WordPress knows exactly what I'm talking about. You spend a lot of time administering your users. Membership tools and learning management services, frankly, are amazing. I still use them both, but for different purposes. But I can assure you, we spend a lot of time and energy administering those membership tools, time that we could be spending creating more content that our community craves and that actually ends up making us money. Patreon lets us keep our eye on the ball, concentrating our efforts on the content and not necessarily on the management. Now let's get into how Patreon actually works. There are three main elements to Patreon. There's the feed, the perks, and then there are tiers. First of all, the feed. When you set up a Patreon account, you get your own private feed. It's sort of like Facebook's news feed or Instagram's feed. Creators post content and your patrons can view, they can download, they can interact with that content because they can respond to it in a variety of ways. And so the feed really feels very similar to the Facebook feed, and you and your patrons will feel instantly comfortable with the feed. It's very nicely executed within Patreon. Perks. Those are the rewards that you offer your supporters. And also typically a creator has multiple tiers of perks. And those tiers of perks are our collection, the tiers themselves are a collection of the perks based on the different pledges that patrons are providing. So you can actually take several perks together and deliver those to your patrons who are paying at a slightly higher level. I think what we should do right now is I should just break away from the slideshow for a minute and let's dive into my Patreon dashboard and just show you the back end of Patreon a little bit so you can see what the creator sees as they interact with their patrons. Okay, this is the Patreon creators dashboard. The dashboard is the control center for patrons, for Patreon creators to be able to manage their Patreon account. Down the left-hand side, we have all of our navigation. In the center, you see an instant snapshot of where you stand statistically as far as revenue and the number of patrons you have. Any messages that you should be addressing are shared here. So this gives you a really good overview to manage your entire account. You create new content and publish new content over here in this sidebar. You can create new posts, which we were just talking about as far as the feed goes. You can go in and you can manage the relationship that you have with all of your patrons, including doing things like downloading their email address and gaining direct access to them, which is one of the most important things that we talked about. And here is a very important section, which is the page itself. As I said off the beginning, we often interchange the word Patreon page with our account. But this is where you go to actually set up things like the different tiers that you have available to your patrons, how much it costs for them to get that tier, and you set what perks and what benefits they have within the page in each one of the tiers. So here's our main tier, which is our $10 tier, and you can see down the bottom we have all of the different benefits that they get as a result of that tier, and you can add or subtract different perks based on the tier level. So this interface is what I was talking about that gives you total control over your Patreon account. You can go into your payment settings, you can communicate with your patrons, you can talk to Patreon itself, dealing with your account. You can add features like adding merchandise, you can edit the outward-facing content that you're sharing with your patrons, you can publish content. Everything happens within this creator dashboard. And when I say it's simple, it is very simple in comparison with managing your content in any other type of site. The Patreon dashboard. So let's talk costs now. And I won't spend too much time on this particular area, but Patreon is free to join. But as any middleman will do, they are going to take their percentage as a percentage of each patron's payment. Now there are 3 different tiers or 3 different levels depending on how many features you want to have within your Patreon account. And each of those levels gives you some more functionality, some more perks, and some more tools for interacting with your patrons. Over time, you'll learn which ones are valuable to you and which ones aren't. But basically, it's going to cost you anywhere from about 5% for at the kind of the basic level, all the way up to 12% of the patron's payments to you in order to use the service on Patreon. And this is a little bit of a misnomer because you also have to add on top of this 2.9%, typically speaking, for the credit card clearing. So it's actually going to cost you anywhere about between 8% and 15% is going to be Patreon, is going to be how much you're going to be paying to be on Patreon. Patreon won't get that whole cut, but that's what it will cost you. That's what you'll have to shave off of your the payments that your patrons are making to you to recognize what's actually going to be transferred into your bank account. Okay, we've gotten through all of the basics. I think it is time to get into what I promised you, which are what are the 4 keys to success on Patreon. Are you ready? Let's go. The first key to success on Patreon is platform, the term that I used early on. If you have an existing platform, and by that I mean a podcast, a video channel, you are creating content and you have a following. If that is the case, you have a chance for success on Patreon because we have a cart horse situation on Patreon. You can use Patreon to monetize your existing content and platform if you have one, but it needs to be established first. You can't launch a successful Patreon campaign if you don't already have an audience. You can't do them in parallel. And this is one of the biggest and most common mistakes I see is launching a Patreon campaign too early. If you have a platform, you can move on to number 2. But so often I will hear people say, I'm launching a podcast and I'm going to pay for it on Patreon. And they have 0 followers on the podcast and they have 0 patrons and they plunge ahead with both and they succeed in neither. The reason is platform comes first. If you have a platform in place, a successful platform, you already have relevance in your potential patrons' life. You're providing them some baseline value. We increase that value and we cement our relationship through perks that we offer. And it is, as I say, a lot of fun to figure out what you can offer your fans. Basically, perks are going to fall into 5 broad categories: access, engagement, recognition, digital bonuses, or physical goods. Those are the prime kind of the prime things that we can offer as perks. And I can give you lots of different examples. You can read through the list here, but you'll recognize a lot of different perks. Early access to content, custom content that you create, say a podcast that you release just for your patrons, photos that you share with them backstage that nobody else gets. You can have live streams. You can have Ask Me Anythings, or you can have online sessions for them. You can do shout outs to them. You can follow them in social. There are all these different perks that you can offer your patrons. We here at Dottotech, for our patrons that follow us on Webinar Wednesday, we give them access to our Webinar Wednesday archives, a real tangible benefit with that back catalog, which I spoke about earlier. Figuring out the perk mix is one of the really most important steps that creators have to determine in order to find success on Patreon. And we don't always hit the ball out of the park on the first effort. I think I've been through about 4 different iterations over my 7 years to find the sweet spot of what I should really be offering my patrons that really resonates with them. It's a learned process, but there are a lot of great examples that will get you thinking about what's going to work and what's not going to work. Establishing tiers. What we do is we mix and match the different perks that we have into packages for our patrons to choose. And those packages are called tiers. So typically speaking, we ladder up value. So for example, you might give somebody at $5 level an access to an ad-free version of a podcast. If they go to the $10 level, you may give them a ad-free version. You give them always what's available in the lower tier perk, but then you add a monthly live stream and Ask Me Anything where you answer whatever questions they ask you. And then if you get to the $20 level, you get both of the previous perks, but maybe we send you a piece of merchandise, a limited edition hat, something along that line. That's how the perks get tiered. And then you let your patrons decide what level they want to support you at. This brings us to our 3rd key, which is ever so important. With Patreon, how you start, how you get out of the gate is very important. So planning a great launch strategy is essential because it's almost a double-edged sword. If you have a platform in place already, you only get one chance to launch to that platform. So the fact that you've already got a bunch of people there that are supporting you, the very first time that you present Patreon to them is going to be the most important time, because they're already following you. They're already your fans. They are your potential audience, and you've got to pitch them properly the first time, because you might never get a second chance. If they say no to Patreon the first time you pitch, they might never return and take a look even after you've changed the perks. So you need to come up with a very successful, very on-point launch strategy when you first start Patreon. And fortunately, there are some great models to use, especially one superior model, I believe, and I will talk more about that in a few moments. The final stage of success for Patreon, the final key, is nurturing our community. We work so hard to gain the support of our patrons, and it behooves us to do everything we can to nurture that relationship. And much of that nurturing comes from how well we deliver all the perks that we've promised. Just like a social platform, consistency and reliability is essential. Meeting your publishing schedule, responding quickly to questions and problems, being visible in your membership area, expressing genuine concern and appreciation for your community. All of these foster a deeper relationship with your community, which provides even greater security for you. But if you've got all four of these keys in place, then Patreon can provide a terrific income vehicle for your platform. For us, it's one of the pillars of business. Now, this gets fun. If you have all four keys in place, you have a platform, you believe that you're ready, how much can you really earn, Steve? Tell me the truth. You've thrown out some numbers, that $500 and $1,000, and we know you earn more. How much can a creator really expect to earn? So let us do the math. I've worked out a model that you can plug in your numbers, and I think you can come up with a very accurate expectation of what Patreon can do for you. Are you ready for it? We're going to switch over. We're going to jump onto my iPad so I can sketch out the equation for you. All right, I've got my iPad open here. Let's do the math. Let's figure out exactly what you can expect based on your platform as far as income from Patreon in a reasonable world. And I think the most important figure to start with, the baseline number that we need to establish, is how many people you have on your mail list. If we look at the mail list, I think we can extrapolate from the mail list a really accurate idea of what we can expect to generate on Patreon. So we'll start with how many email subscribers do you have? And we will, for this particular case, you have to excuse my handwriting. I know it's terrible. You have to, for this particular case, we'll say you have 10,000 subscribers. That's a reasonable number of email subscribers to have on a mail list, but it also represents a number that's really easy for us to extrapolate other numbers based on what your own personal numbers are. Now, if you have 10,000 subscribers on your email list, the first question I ask is, how many of those are real fans? How many of those are your most strong followers? The raving fans that we would call them. And the 80-20 rule really comes into play here. If you have a mail list of 10,000 people, you probably recognize, if you look at your statistics, that 2,000 of those people will open most of your emails. They will sign up for your webinars. They are your engaged audience. Those are the people who you have an opportunity to increase the relationship with, because I would call those 2,000 people fans. And this math works out. I'll show you later on in my own mail list how accurate this is. And this carries through for pretty much everybody. That means that 8,000 of those people are soft. They aren't necessarily, they're followers. They aren't really committed to you yet. They're fans. They are the ones that unsubscribe, or they don't stay on your mail list for all time, and they don't open all of your emails. But those 2,000 fans, that's the group that we're going to start to work with. The number that I want to work out is, of those 2,000 fans that you have, of those 2,000 people that open all of your emails, that are your true fans, what is a reasonable percentage of those people to expect will actually support you on Patreon if you put together an offering which appeals to them? Is it 10%? I think that's pretty reasonable. Is it 20%? That might be even more reasonable. So if we look at probably somewhere between 10 and 20% of those followers will convert to support you on Patreon, that means that you can start by considering right at the beginning that you could have, say, between 200 and 400 Patreon supporters just from your existing list. I think that's a very reasonable expectation. So now let us continue and let's work out the next phase of math. So Statistics will tell us that on Patreon, the average contribution of a patron to a creator is $7. That is the average Patreon contribution. The average creator gets, it's actually between $7 and $12, but $7 is kind of at the low end of that scale. So let's say that you have 200 fans who will convert at $7 per month or $7 per event on Patreon to support you. What does the math work out to? And at that point there, you have 200 times 7 is $1,400 per month. That already puts you in the top 4% of support on Patreon, just if 10% of your fans support you. Have I overstated? Do you think that 10% of your fans is a excessive or a high number to expect support from? How does the math work if we go to, say, 5% or even 2.5%? Based on the other numbers that we've illustrated. So at 5% times is 100 followers, which will equal $700 per month. And of course, 2.5% will be half of that. So it'll be $350 per month. Now, do you need some proof? Let's go through and let's take a look at and see if we can prove some of these numbers out to you. So I'm going to take you into my real numbers. I'm going to completely pull back the curtains and show you that this math works. So first of all, this is my Infusionsoft, my Keep account. And you can see here that we currently have 35,715 subscribers. So let's just mark this down. Let's mark this down as 35,000, we'll just say round it out to 35,000 email subscribers on our list. That's first proof number one. We're going to use that as our baseline number. But before we do that, I want to go in and I want to show you some of our email open rate statistics. If I go in and view our existing email that we send out. Now, we send out some specialized emails that are just for certain vertical groups, but the ones I want to show you are our This Week in Dottotech. Those are our general emails that go out to our entire mail list. So here is a week ago, This Week in Dottotech. If we scroll across, we see there open rate 20%. Bang on with what I said as far as the 80-20 rule. If you want more proof, let's go down to another Dottotech this week. Going back in February, 19%. Right within the margin of error. Go down to Dottotech this week, 22%. It proves out, these statistics prove out, 20% is our average open rate. We have 20% of our fans. The 80-20 rule works as far as I'm concerned. So let's see if the proof is in the pudding. Let's go over now and let's take a look at my Patreon page. And on my Patreon page, we'll see that we currently have $6,200 per month. Now, as I record this, it's just after the beginning of the month, so the number always drops a little bit. But the total revenue that we're earning now, U.S. funds, that is coming into my platform on Patreon, is $6,200 per month. Let's run the numbers and see if my equation works. All right, let us take those real world numbers and apply them to the equation that I shared with you earlier and see if the math works. So based on our verifiable numbers, we have 35,000 subscribers to the mail list at Dottotech, and I am earning $6,200 per month currently on Patreon based on those numbers. So what was the equation? The first one was the 80-20 rule. And 20% of 35,000 is 7,000 fans. 7,000 fans. Now, what did we say the ratio was? We had 20%. We expected between 10 and 20% of those to convert into supporting us on Patreon. So 10% of 7,000 is 700 subscribers on Patreon or Patreon supporters. To 20% would be 1,400 supporters on Patreon. Just by way of example, we're currently at 755 patrons as of this moment, as I record this. So again, the math is proving out just over 10%. We said that the average support on Patreon is $7 per supporter. Let's do the math now. $7 times 700 subscribers equals $4,900. That's at the low end of what support we could expect based on 35,000 subscribers on our mail list. At the high end, at 20%, we can basically double that times 1,400. And that math then works out to $9,800. In the real world, what numbers do we really have? We have $6,200. $6,200 in support, right smack in the middle between the $4,900 at 10% and the $8,900 that would be at 20%, or $9,800, excuse me, that would be at 20%. The math works. This equation is accurate. If you can define exactly how large your mail list is and you build a successful Patreon campaign, a well thought out Patreon campaign, you can expect to generate monthly recurring revenue in that sort of a range. It gets pretty exciting, doesn't it? So as you can see, the math works. You can determine, I think, very accurately what you can expect to receive in Patreon support based on the size and following you have of your mail list. All right, that is it for this. Does this excite you? Does this intrigue you? If so, I have some exciting news. So let's go back to me live now and continue on. Now, so I love those numbers. The numbers just work out. It gets me absolutely fired up. So I'm curious as to if you enjoyed that, if you found that was illuminating. I know some people feel that there's a big pitch coming. Yes, there is a big pitch coming. That's what I'm just about to do. No surprise there. As I said right off the top of the webinar, that we have a new course that we're going to be launching. So if this is indeed excited you, if this is something which you are intrigued by, then I do think I've got some really exciting news for you, because I am launching our Patreon bootcamp. It's 30 days to a successful Patreon launch. And as I say, this has been about 6 months in the works when I first started to work on this idea of sharing the understanding that we have on Patreon, but it's really been 8 years in the works as well, because we now have 8 years of experience on Patreon. So I put this program together, pulling all of those years of experience together and having coached a lot of different Patreon creators to success. I wanted to create a system that you can rely on to take all of your hard work and to basically make sure that it generates consistent recurring revenue for you. Now, the bootcamp itself is going to be a true bootcamp. It's going to last for a month. Every day during the month during the 30 days that we run it, every weekday, we're going to be dropping one brand new lesson, 20 lessons in total, Monday to Friday. And it's a mixture of live and pre-recorded lessons. So I'm going to be holding your hand for the entire month. The modules are short and to the point and totally relevant. They're going to be between 7 and 30 minutes each as far as the amount of time that you're going to expect to be spending. One of the modules is going to be much longer, but that I'll explain in a moment. The bootcamp is not for everybody, though. We're offering this to creators who are ready to take advantage of Patreon. So you're going to have a platform in place that you're leveraging. So we're actually going to have an approval process, and you're going to have to apply. It's going to be quick and painless, but I have to make sure that you're ready because we're going to be teaching you how to take a platform and leverage it into income, as opposed to building a platform. We're teaching you how to blend that platform in on Patreon. We're not going to be teaching you how to actually build up the platform. It's going to be once your platform is in place. So it's for a little bit more mature creator. The focus is going to, if we take a look back at my 4 keys to success, which were platform, perks, launch, and nurturing, it really starts in the perks phase, where we look at how you build out a Patreon offering, launch it, and then nurture it. I also make sure that I'm going to identify all of the pitfalls and traps that derail so many Patreon creators. And now for the kicker. I love this part. I absolutely love this part. We're going to host the entire bootcamp inside of Patreon. So you're going to experience both sides of the Patreon experience. Every day, we're going to be posting the lesson in the Patreon newsfeed. Then the questions, comments, suggestions, the interaction with the other members of the bootcamp are all going to happen in the feed inside of Patreon. So you'll get the experience of Patreon as a supporter, what your supporters will experience later, as well as a creator, as you learn to be a creator on it. Let me just quickly go over, I'll make this as quick as I can, over the course outline so you can get an idea of what we plan to cover. We're going to start with an overview of the Patreon dashboard on day 1, then planning your community, building your tiers and perks, and setting up your homepage, which is your landing page and basically your Patreon account. Then we have our live session number 1. Now, we do have a 30-day money-back guarantee, or not a 30-day, excuse me, a 7-day money-back guarantee. So the end of the first week, you can consume the whole week's of content. If it's not for you, then we'll offer you a refund at that point there. Once the first week is passed, then the refund period is cleared, but basically no risk because you'll get a really good idea of the type of content, the level of content, and whether it's relevant for you by the end of that first week. Week 2, Patreon integrations, integrating Patreon with your other systems, content mapping, planning out your content mix on Patreon, the ultimate Patreon launch plan. I told you there was going to be one lesson that's longer. How you launch a Patreon campaign, we're going to be giving you chapter and verse how to do that. That's going to be a little bit of a longer lesson. And then this is a great lesson, this next one. It's my step-by-step guide to onboarding and validating your patrons. So important long-term in the health of your community is validating your patrons and making sure that their first experience is awesome. We have developed a terrific system for that. And I think all of our patrons that support us at Dottotech will probably concur. I'm going to be teaching that. Week 3 starts with your feed, posts, content, and conversations, then managing your content, developing some sort of a content delivery network, because while Patreon does a great job within the feed, we often need to support our content with an external tool. So we're going to be talking about that. Nurturing your patrons, then upping your game through events and challenges, upping your Patreon game. Then our 3rd live session before the final week, where we talk about boosting engagement and conversations, which over the long haul is going to really cement your patrons and keep them engaged with your community. And this one is important, setting boundaries and avoiding burnout. One thing that a lot of Patreon creators do is they burn out, is they set too high in expectations. They just burn too brightly, and at the end of the day, they aren't able to continue to meet the pace, or they give too much access to their patrons, and they get overwhelmed with that. So setting your boundaries and avoiding burnout is a really important lesson, somewhat sobering. Then we look at the advanced dashboard and analytics. We take a look at how the numbers that we're getting on Patreon, how we use those to increase the value of our Patreon community and increase the amount that we earn from it. And then finally, although it's probably not going to be needed, it's a real healthy process to set up an exit strategy and pay attention to it right from the beginning. Although in Patreon is different than most other platforms where you do own the relationship with your client, you still have to have some sort of a system in place that if Patreon goes away, if they disenfranchise you for some reason, if something happens that's unforeseen and you have to move your community, you are thinking about how you're structuring things right from the beginning should that eventuality happen. Because the bottom line is, if you do it right, Patreon is going to become an important part of your weekly or your monthly revenue. And if that gets disrupted in any ways, it can be very devastating to a business. So having an exit strategy, that's a great insurance policy. And then we've got one last bonus, which will be, we're actually going to walk through how we actually built our own Patreon, the boot camp itself, because it'll be a really good look at the different mechanisms within Patreon. So that's going to be a bonus, which we'll do after the boot camp is pretty much done. Now, I got to tell you this. I am really excited for our students because this is going to be just an incredible experience. You're going to be learning best practices from me, a 7-year successful creator on Patreon, but you're also going to be sharing ideas and concerns and encouragement with other creators because we're limiting the course to only successful content creators. They've all got established platforms, so you're going to be dealing with peers who are going to bring a lot of different experience and a lot of different value to the equation. In many ways, I think that being part of this group is going to be as valuable as what we teach in the course. And that's been borne out in our other membership sites. Within our Gray Wave, I can guarantee you, anybody who's here in the webinar right now that's part of the Gray Wave will talk about the strength of community, of having peers that support you and you can bounce ideas off of. That's going to be even amplified within this particular community. It is going to be a special month. Now, the details. We are accepting applications right now. April is dropping the very first links to the sales page. The doors close on this May 15th at midnight Pacific time. And when the doors are closed, they're closed. because lesson 1 drops May 17th, and we're not bringing in anybody late. The cohort has to go through all at the same time. The costs, I know you're all waiting for the costs. Okay, here they are. The cost is $5.99. And we don't really have any special bonuses or special offers that we have, except we have 2 discounts that are available for 2 special groups. It would be, if you're one of my existing patrons, you get one of the perks that we offer in our Patreon offering is 50% off on our courses. Patrons still need to apply. They still need to pass the application process. But if they do pass that, then they get a 50% discount, which is one of the perks that we historically give to our patrons. And our Gray Wave members, people who are part of our membership site, will also be invited with the same discount. But the Gray Wave, because the Gray Wave teaches people how to develop a platform, they don't have to apply because I know they're already well on the road to understanding how platforms work and developing their own platform. So I'm going to summarize. 20 daily lessons, 4 interactive sessions, community access, daily feedback from me and the team for the entire month. And if you do the math, if I can get you to the 8% level, which I believe we can without too much difficulty, then the first month, or once you're kind of established on Patreon, the first month is going to pay for the cost of the course. And from there on, it's kind of gravy at that point. So I hope that you can see why I'm so excited about this. This bootcamp is going to give, I'm really excited about this, a bunch of talented creators ongoing funding that they deserve. And it's going to make a difference in their life. Oh, yes, we are going to leave a mark. So let us now jump into the Q&A. So April, do you want to open your mic and open your video, and let's get the Q&A going. Now, we're going to answer as many of the questions. Whether we have 5 minutes. I got it in the hour.
You did. I think
so. Here's what's going to happen. We'll answer as many questions as we can. At the top of the hour, anybody who has to go, we will continue to record the Q&A for about maybe 10 or 15 minutes after, since I know there'll be at least that many questions. But if you leave, you can always catch that in the replay if you're interested. So, April, what have we got?
I think the biggest question is the minimum email address, because it sounds like a lot of people here, you use the example of your list and then you use the example of the 10,000, but there's a lot of people that are not nearly that close to having that size list or are just getting started with list building.
So I used the email list as an example because it was a number that we could work with and that I could verify by taking you into the numbers and showing you. And they're I believe that those numbers are very secure and very firm as far as being accurate. You could also look at, if you're a podcaster, if you have X number of downloads per month, if you are a YouTube publisher, if you have X number of video views per month, those numbers are a little bit softer, but you can get a good idea of what your engagement rate would be from your other publishing numbers. The biggest reason that most Patreon accounts don't succeed is this kind of a model. Is somebody says, I'm launching a podcast, I'm going to launch a Patreon campaign to pay for the podcast, and they have 0 followers in each, and it's a recipe for disaster. They're frustrated in both because neither succeeds. In order to use Patreon, you have to have some sort of a platform in place. Now, I think that an email list of 500, you could start thinking about things. But the key is, are you going to have reasonable expectations at that point? Like if you have 500 followers and you run the math through, you're going to recognize that you're going to earn $150 or $200 a month, recognizing that you're going to be growing it. Is that something that you're comfortable with and you're willing to invest that time and energy in to grow? It's all about clarity and understanding. So we're not selling you a bill of goods saying if with 500 followers you're going to earn $6,000 a month like we do. No. But if you're at 1,000 subscribers in your email list, you can at least get an accurate picture of what to expect and what a target is. And then as you grow, you'll recognize what that growth will reflect in your Patreon support. I know that doesn't answer the question with a firm number because it's going to be a personal decision.
All right. So then the other question that's come up, there was a question about Mighty Networks, but I think people don't really understand the difference between Patreon and Mighty Networks, or Patreon and Thinkific. So if you could really define that parallel, I think that would be helpful.
There was a couple of questions. One was about Mighty Networks and the other was about Ko-fi or coffee. Buy me a coffee. ones that they've got. And so there's a couple of different ones in that space. So first of all, with Mighty Networks is a beautiful platform, but it is a membership site platform. It's designed as when I was talking about membership platforms earlier on, that's what Mighty Networks is. People who sign up and support you on Mighty Networks will be your customer. They won't see themselves as a patron or as a supporter. They will see themselves as a customer, unless you can really do a lot of machination to convince them otherwise. That's number one. But number two is it's a framework that you have to build out the entire infrastructure for. The amount of time and energy you're going to spend within Mighty Networks to get the support from your community, to deliver content in your community, is the same effort as you would put into a membership site. A lot more administration, a lot more building and laying out the structure in the overall platform. Patreon is a pretty much locked environment. The amount of time the fact that we can teach you all of this in 30 days means that Patreon, you don't have a lot of decisions to make. You don't make a lot of design decisions. You don't make a lot of delivery decisions. It's all been kind of proven in the pudding, so in the design of Patreon. So it's a much simpler thing to administer from your perspective. As far as costs, it may or may not be cheaper depending on what features you add into your Mighty Networks account, but it's got a very different philosophy. Mighty Networks, if you're considering a learning management tool like Thinkific, or you're considering a membership site like Kajabi, Mighty Networks comes into play, and it gives you a very Facebook-like interface for those particular membership sites. As I say, we really evaluated it as we were developing the Gray Wave. We went pretty far down the path of trying to make it work, but it wasn't perfect for us. There were some reasons that we didn't, but I never, ever considered it to be a competition for Patreon. Having said that, there's a few tipping sites like Buy Me a Coffee and others that are similar. They're just smaller, and they just, as far as I'm concerned, if you're gonna step into this space, you might as well go with the best known player, which is Patreon.
Okay, so I'm sorry, the chat's moving here. So, okay, if approved to be a boot camp member and the course dates conflict with the time, are we able to watch and participate from a recorded version?
Yeah, and you don't have to go through it in real time. So I think most people are going to go through it in pretty close to real time because a lot of the conversation and the energy is going to be in that first month. But the way that we're doing it is we're setting it up as a Patreon campaign. You're logging in, and that content will be available to you for at least a year. So if you're going to be launching your Patreon campaign later, you'll have access. We haven't decided yet what the long-term, if we're going to be doing it, if we're, depending on how many people sign up for the course and how successful it is, it might be something that we do once. But I tend to think that we'll probably be repeating it, in which case all of our members, as we always do with all of our courses, are grandfathered in. They can take the content on an ongoing basis. What we will commit to you is, if we do pull down the Patreon campaign, the site, all of the course content will still be available to you. We'll make sure that you can download it, or we'll make sure it's in a repository somewhere else so that you can access it for all time.
How did you get to 5,000 email addresses with Dottotech? How long did it take you?
When you started with me, how many did I have? Do you remember? I think I had 8,000. I think it took me 2 or 3 years to get to 5,000.
No, I don't think you had 8,000 yet. Actually.
Did we have less?
Yeah, you had less. I think really what put your email list building into high gear was Webinar Wednesday.
This was when we started Webinar Wednesday, yeah.
Yeah, Webinar Wednesday is really where it, so.
Yeah.
Okay. So the other questions are current Patreon members. Did I lose you? Did you go away? Yeah, you're gone. Where'd you go? So current Patreon members and Gray Wave members get 50% off the course, and we will send you a separate email with all of that information. Are you still there?
I think so.
Okay, I just don't see you. No, I don't see you. And let's see, could Patreon be something for a nonprofit? Is this something that a nonprofit could benefit from? All right, are you still there? I think he went off storming the castle. All right, so Patreon members get 50% off. Gray Wave get 50% off. Let's see. Okay, so let's see. I'm just going through the questions. I'm waiting for him to come back in. So Margie's asking if you have no email list yet. So no email list, you want to look to build your email list with list builders and things like that. A Facebook page is a great place for you to market your business, but it's not a way for you to build your email list. So you want to look at ways to definitely build your email list, whether you have an event, a webinar, have a checklist, have something where you're offering that to collect an email address, especially even on your website. All right.
I think I'm back. Am I back?
Nope, don't see you. But you can stay there and at least answer questions.
I don't know what's going on.
All right. So you can have a free tier in Patreon, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So
can you hear me? How are you hearing me?
I hear you fine.
Oh, you can hear me. You just can't see me.
We can't see you. So is it possible to give a free tier for close followers so there will be initial community for others to join into?
Yes, Patreon does have a free tier. You can set up a free tier. Yeah, and you can, and it's just basically following you, and you set up public posts for that.
All right. Milt's asking, apparently YouTube doesn't like a creator to deliver content on another platform. So how do you get around that?
YouTube doesn't like creators to deliver content on another platform? That's not true. YouTube doesn't mind it. All right. I don't know if you mean they don't want you, like, if you're talking about the kind of competition between YouTube and Facebook to put in the same content on, that's a totally different story. But when I post videos on Patreon, I post Vimeo videos because they're private for the community. So I don't use YouTube as much for Patreon.
All right. Kathy's asking, do you name your tiers?
Yes, you can name them whatever you want.
All right. Do you have to contribute on a monthly basis, or can you make a one-time donation on Patreon?
So you can set up, so at a higher tier, you can set up, you can set up an annual subscription. So the payment options.
Steve, we lost you. So Steve had a bunch of gadgets going on today, friends. And so when he does these gadgets,
Am I still here?
Now you're back. Now we can hear you.
But it's just a video for some reason. I thank God it lasted to the end of the presentation. Well, so there's three different tiers. There's three different types of payment. You can pay monthly. You can pay by the creation. So it could be a song, an album, a piece of artwork. It could be a video that's created. So you're paid by the piece of work. Or they have if you buy the premium, the top end subscription, you can get annual payments. So people can pay for year access in advance.
Okay. Let's see. So what does an audience mean in terms of numbers? So I'm not sure there's necessarily a set number, but.
I don't know what that means. I'm sorry. Your audience is the community that's listening to you and opening and consuming the content.
This is actually a great question. Is Patreon difficult to organize?
No, that's one of the beauties of it. Within the community, within the boot camp, we only spend one day on setting up the structure. We spend a lot of time on the philosophy, on how you choose your perks, how you present your content to your patrons, how you want your relationship with your patrons to be. But the physical infrastructure, it's only all done in one lesson.
Okay. Is it possible to do a writing model with a podcast in addition to that?
Sure. You can add, if what I think you're asking is, can you have different types of content that is included in Patreon as the benefits to your patrons? Yes. If you had a podcast and say you had you posted a blog post or that was custom just for the patrons, based on that, that's fine. You can create all sorts of custom content, and there's a lot of unique ways. One of the things that I teach in the modules is I talk a lot about whether or not, as you're building your perks, you should be, when we go through the exercise of finding perks, it's a wonderful lesson because you throw all of these ideas at the wall and you kind of get really excited about these different perks that you can offer. But then we go through a distillation process where we say, wait a minute, which ones of these are going to increase a lot of work and increase value to our patrons. Which one of these can we increase value to our patrons, which aren't a lot of work for us? That's sustainability, the avoiding burnout. So quickly you'll come to a realization that there's some things that you can offer your patrons that have tremendous value that aren't a lot of incremental work for you. That's the sweet spot that we look for.
So I think you were having like your video and your audio blipped out. So is Patreon appropriate can nonprofits do well on using Patreon as
yeah, I don't see why not. Absolutely.
Okay. And then can you talk to kind of the pricing behind it? So how much, like if you're getting money, how much does Patreon take the cost of the
Okay, so Patreon's take is going to be anywhere between the combination of Patreon and the merchant services, because you have to always add 2.9% to Patreon's take. You add 2.9% for the credit card clearing, because it's all done through credit card, of course. So it's anywhere between 8% and 15% of your total take. The number that's reflected on your Patreon dashboard is after Patreon takes the cut. So that's a real number that you're going to be having delivered. And actually, every month, because of just the way that the accounting works, I typically see about 5% more than what I see on my dashboard is what actually goes into my account every month.
Okay. And I think that's it. Let's see. Follow-up question. Does Steve offer discount for nonprofits to take the course?
Drop us an email and let us know what your situation is, and we'll have a look at it. But the quickest way to do that is to become one of our patrons. It costs $10 a month, and then you get the 50% discount.
And so
then it's guaranteed.
Right. Second question about setting goals on Patreon. Should we prefer small goals that fans will feel motivated to support so they'll make a difference? Or do you suggest bigger goals that will make a real difference to you as a content creator?
The goals were a big part of the initial launch of Patreon, and people used to, in the communities, we used to really get excited about the goals. If you have the kind of relationship with your supporting community that they will get behind the goals, I would say a combination of both would be best. Most Patreon supporters don't pay too much attention to the goals, I would say, unless there's some real benefit in them. For example, if you say, if we hit this mark here, then I'm going to release the last chapter of the book that you've been waiting for. Those sorts of things will really motivate them. But for the most part, the goal setting has become a secondary strategy within Patreon.
All right. I have 2 podcasts on different topics, 1 or 2 Patreon accounts.
I have to think that 2 would be better. You don't want to confuse people.
Yeah. All right. I think that is
unless they're on different topics. If they're different audiences, for sure. If they're the same audience, you could, but I would lean towards 2.
Okay, I think we are good. So the replay, it will be available tomorrow.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, and that's it. I think that's it. We covered everything. So.
Well, this has been I hope that you folks enjoyed it. I got excited about this, and the thing that I'm most excited about is I know what it means to me to see that check come in every month from Patreon. And it has given us security, and it has changed my attitude as a content creator. You go from feast and famine, where you're only making money when you're doing product launches, to this steady, reliable, recurring income that happens month after month. And it's content that is part of our mix that we know we can support the Patreon community. We know what value we bring. And oh my gosh, it has been liberating as far as the amount of pressure that it puts on me. It's been tremendous. So I'm looking forward to giving other creators that same sense of security. At the end of the day, that's going to be magical. So keep your eyes open on your emails. I'm looking forward to as many of you as possible joining us for this journey. It is going to be really, I think it's going to be awesome. It could be life-changing for some of us. April, thank you so much.
Hi guys, thank you.
Till next time, have fun storming the castle.